stones and set them up as an altar. And I want you to do that so that when your children see it one day, this next generation, then they will tell the story of what happened. They can make tribute to what happened. And you'll tell them that God made a way. You'll tell them that God got us across this uncrossable barrier, this external force. That it was God that did this. And God says, okay, 12 guys, one from each tribe, 12 stones, set it up, make an altar. Now, guess where He told them to get the stones from? Back in the Jordan River. You know, I want you to go back in the river that you just came out of and haul 12 big stones to make an altar. You see, what's happened is God is teaching His people that I've got so much power, and I want to be willing, I want to show it in your life. But if you want to see my power in your life, you have to take a risk. You'll have to take the spiritual risk of trusting me first. To be in relationship with me, to enter into the kind of life I'm calling you to. If you're going to do that, it's going to involve some spiritual risk-taking. It's going to involve this risk of obedience. And for some of us, that scares us to death. It scares us to death. God will do it, but you've got to part the waters first. Let's keep going. Barrier number 2, and that's our health. Okay, our health. Our health is a barrier. God tells Joshua, okay, all the men of Israel, you're going to undergo this medical procedure called circumcision. You guys are going to go to war. Now, let me ask you a practical question here. If you were going to war, you just crossed the Jordan River, there's no escape getting back across the river, would this be a moment to have your entire army go through circumcision? I don't think so. Probably not the most opportune time. God, why couldn't you thought about this a week ago, before we crossed the Jordan? But God wants to know, do you really trust me? Do you really trust that I'll protect you? Will you really obey me? Are you not only willing to say, I want to be like Jesus, are you willing to say, I want to look like Jesus? Will you back it up with your actions? Will you let your own lack of strength and health, will you let that be a factor in your obedience? God's saying, will you trust my strength? Will you trust my provision? Do you really believe that I am who I say I am? And I've read this multiple times this week, and I'm certain that almost every single person in this room has had or are dealing with some sort of a health barrier in their life. Because see, when we don't feel good, it's so easy to just want to crawl back in bed and pull the blankets over top of our heads and just hide. We feel itchy, And I'm certain that every single one of the Hebrew men, they wanted to do this. But they did not allow their health to be a barrier. They pressed forward despite their condition and let God be their strength. They didn't let their health get in the way. Let's keep going. Go to Joshua 6, where we find the story of the fall of Jericho. Now, what you need to know here is that Jericho is very old. It's the oldest of the fortified cities in Canaan, if not the whole world. But also, what I found very interesting, a couple commentaries said this, that Jericho was very, very small. Primary archaeologists, the early part of the 20th century, said their estimate was it was about 4 or 5 acres. Basically what our property is right here. That's what it was. That's what their side was. It was quite small. So, Israel could have defeated by attack and siege or attack. Israel would have won. But instead, they get this command, and it's barrier number 3. Resources. It has to do with resources. Joshua 6 says this, walk around Jericho 7 days, and on the 7th day walk around it 7 times. Now, friends, the soldiers, I'm sure just like some of you going around the sanctuary, felt a little silly doing this. It would have been a lot easier to take guns and knives and swords and spears, but God says, no, here's a lesson of trust. You take your kazoos, you take your slide whistles, you take your tambourines, and do some trusting. Do some trusting. Resources have always been a huge barrier for people. A huge barrier. Whether it's not the right weapon, or not the right armor, or not the right fortress. If it's not one thing, it's another thing. And it continues today, but not just with military equipment. We let our lack of resources be a barrier from serving God. I've talked to so many people that say, you know, Jeff, my little tithe, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. You know, my time, what I do, it doesn't make a difference. My home, it's too small. I can't do a Bible study. It's not adequate. Friends, I want to tell you, don't let your resources keep you doing what God is calling you to do. Press forward. Now, let's keep going. One of the great stories of trust and one of my Bible heroes is found in 14:10, Joshua 14:10. This is the story of Caleb. Now, this guy was a man's man. He was one of the 12 spies, you remember, sent out by Moses to the Promised Land, and only Caleb and Joshua, they trusted God. They're the ones that came back and said, let's do it. Let's go after him. And because of Israel's unbelief, Caleb had to spend the next 40 years of his life in the wilderness. Now, from when he was 40 years old, the next 4 decades, he can't cross the Jordan. And this is not because of his lack of faith, but because of the people's. And by the time they got to cross the Jordan, he's 80 years old. And now this is 5 years later. Caleb is now 85 years old. Keep that in mind. Joshua 14:10. This is Caleb talking. Now then, just as the Lord promised, He has kept me alive for 45 years since the time He said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the desert. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still just as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out and do battle as I was then. That's a pretty amazing statement for an 85-year-old guy. He says, now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard that the Anakites were there. And these were the big, strong, giant people. And their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as He said. He says, this is an 85-year-old guy, give me the hill country. I don't want the easy one. I don't want the condo in Arizona. You know, I want the hard guys. Most people are thinking retirement. Not this guy, you know. He's ready to take them. It's a really hard job, and he's ready to do it. He says, give me one more chance to cross that Jordan. Give me one more chance to do a really hard thing for God. Give me one more chance to really trust Him. He says, yeah, I'm 85, but I've been waiting for 45 years. I've been waiting for this chance. Don't let me miss it now. You see, Caleb understood that God was sufficient. He understood that God could do it. He wasn't afraid then, and he's not afraid now. And those external forces, those health, those resources, they were not going to be barriers to him. He was ready to go for it. Barriers are not going to stop him. Now, I want to spend the last few moments of the message on a more personal issue. I want to think about our barriers. Here in Battle Lake, what is our barriers? What is our Jordan River? I want to ask you, where is God asking you to take a step of faith? Because here's what I know. Every single one of us in this room faces our own Jordan River. Every single one of us in this room face barriers that try to prevent us from entering the life that God has for us. Every one of us do. And God says, I've already gone ahead of you. I'm going to be there waiting. And every single step you take, I've occupied the land, but you've got to choose. And stepping into Jordan, you know, whatever your Jordan it is, it always involves overcoming fear. And that's why God says over and over again in Joshua, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Over and over. So where are you afraid? My favorite story about fear is from a good friend of mine. He knew God was calling him to do something, and it scared him to death. So he took his wife on a real long walk, and he was walking and talking. He says, you know, I know God's calling me to do something, and I'm really scared to do this. And he says, every time I think about this, my palms get sweaty. He kept walking. But an hour later into the walk, still walking and talking about the same thing. He says, honey, he says, every time I think about doing this, my mouth gets dry. She says, honey, I think it's time to lick your palms. Yeah. A gift of mercy is a wonderful thing. I tell you that story because for some people in this room, in your life, in your walk with God, it's palm licking time. It's palm licking time. It's time for a spiritual risk. It's time. Now, God's power generally gets released when somebody trusts Him enough to obey Him. Generally. And some people spend their whole life standing, scared to death on the banks of the Jordan, waiting for that water to part first. Okay, God, you part the waters, and then I'll go across. God, you make it real easy for me, and I'll do it. I'll do it, God. But you have to move first. Maybe you're thinking, all I got to do is hit the lotto. If I just hit the lotto, boy, I'd give church 10% right away. I just got to win the lotto. God, give me a lot of money, then I'll be generous. I think about our own personal life. There's been so many times in our marriage when bills were due and our boys needed lunch money and the car was on empty and no money for tithe. Maybe we better give double next week. What are we going to do? And that wasn't the question. It's, we give our tithe and do we pay the water? We pay the electric this week. Because you know what? You can't give out God. You cannot give God. We'd write a check for $75 and next day in the mail, boom, there's a check for $50 or $75, whatever. I believe with all my heart you can't outgive God. You see, it's the giving that comes first. And it doesn't mean that, it's an automatic way to get there. But when we stand by the side of the Jordan and say, God, you make it easy first. You send the resources first. Then I'll become a generous person. You're going to wait a long time. You trust God because, friends, that's where the adventure is. It's stepping into the Jordan. Maybe you're tempted to think, God, give me lots of confidence, then I'll tell somebody about you. Make it real easy for me, God. There's a risk. You look back at what God has told other people to do. We studied a couple weeks ago, God told Moses, go talk to Pharaoh. You go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Now think about that. What would be the worst case scenario for Moses to tell the people, let my people go? They would kill him, right? Absolutely. That's the worst case scenario. God told Joshua, get the people across the Jordan River. What's the worst case scenario? They all drowned. They die. New Testament, God says to Paul, I want you to proclaim the gospel in the face of Roman persecution and Roman jail. What's the worst thing happened to Paul? Well, he could die. But let's talk about Battle Aiken today. I say take an invite card to one of your friends and invite them to come to church. What's the worst case scenario? They're not going to kill you. They're your friend, I hope. They might say no, Pastor. What would I do then? You say, okay, maybe next time. Worst case scenario, they say no, Do you understand the legacy that we're a part of? We are a part of a people who faced death for God. Part of a people who still face death for God. If you ask somebody to share your faith, you say, come with me, they might say no. They might. But if you don't, how can they say yes? But you got to step into the Jordan River. And nobody can do that for you. You got to get your feet wet. Maybe you're tempted to say, God, give me lots of time. Then I'll really start to study your word. I'll start to do that. And that's our fourth barrier. We all face that. That fourth barrier is time. God, give me more hours in the day. God, open up my calendar book. I just don't have time. Give me time. Real quick, go to Joshua 10. This is a great story. You got to catch this. Israel's fighting at Gibeon and they're running out of time. And they're in the thick of the battle. They're running out of time. What does God do? He makes the sun stand still. God says, you need more time? No problem. I made time. I can make extra time. God says it's my possession. And God made more time for them. You see, God is the Lord of time. He is the Lord of stuff. But you've got to trust God first. You've got to step in the Jordan first. And again, friends, I don't know what it means for you. But each one of us faces the Jordan. I know that. And I know that you've got to take